They went out for future of Iran. For an Iran without Ayatollahs, without Islamic Republic, without Khamenei.
A desperate plea for help from inside Iran. Today we speak to someone closely connected to a slain protester and two imprisoned brothers.
I can tell you there are people in Iran who take the air traffic every night to see if there are less airplanes in the sky. So maybe this is tonight that the intervention helps us. You have to be in some point that wish another country comes and brings military to your country to save you. And this is the point Iranian just reached.
But first, the geopolitics shaping what comes next. What is the real stance of Iran's Arab neighbors, and how might that influence whether U.S. intervention happens or doesn't? We're joined by Sir John Jenkins, Senior Fellow at Policy Exchange and former UK Ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He is the co-author of the Policy Exchange paper, The Iran Question and British Strategy.
I think strategically they'd like it to change, but they don't know how it's going to happen. And they fear the consequences in different ways, both of disorder and of, as it were, catastrophic success.
And President Trump's meeting in Washington with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. What was said behind closed doors, and what does it mean for the future of a free Iran? Joining us, Dr. Eric Mandel, founder and director of MEPIN, the Middle East Political and Information Network, and Ambassador John Craig, who was in Iran as the revolution swept the country on assignment for President Jimmy Carter.
Demand the terms that he's asking for, and it's a prequel, in my view, to military action.
From a longtime Khamenei advisor, Mohammad Javad Larijani, he said, quote, "It's Persian wisdom. We don't have to be ideal people. Everybody lies. Let's be good liars."
I'm Negar Moshehedi, and this is Eye for Iran. As Iran reels from mass killings at home, the region is watching closely. How are Tehran's Arab neighbors really responding behind closed doors? Are they bracing for escalation or quietly preparing for regime change? We're joined now by Sir John Jenkins, Senior Fellow at Policy Exchange and former UK Ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Sir John, thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Sir John, how would you assess the position of Iran's Arab neighbors since the massacre? Publicly we hear diplomatic language, but privately, how are they reading Tehran right now? Are they fearful of escalation? Or are they quietly hoping for a change in Iran?
Iran has always been a problem for the Arab Gulf states. First of all, its sheer size. There are 90 million Iranians currently. There's probably around 27 million citizens of the 6 GCC states.
Yes.
And Iran's geopolitical position and its potential position in energy markets and so forth gives it a weight that the Gulf states in particular, but not just the Gulf states. We've seen it in Jordan as well, and more recently, I think, in Iraq and Syria in different ways, have to take into consideration. This was a problem before the Islamic Republic, and it became a particular problem after 1979 because of the intent of the Islamic Republic to export the revolution and its aggressive tactics from time to time in the Gulf, not just in the Iran-Iraq war, but subsequently. And we've seen that, most recently with the attempted drone issue with American warships in the Gulf. And there was a point after 2015, so when King Salman succeeds King Abdullah and Prince Mohammed bin Salman becomes Crown Prince, when the Saudis in particular were actually pretty aggressive towards Iran. Some of this came out of what is happening in Syria, some of it came out of what is happening with the Houthis in Yemen. But there was quite a lot of quite aggressive rhetoric and the exchange of sort of gamer-style videos between the two sides, which suggested the Saudis thought that they had the ability in some way to resist or push back against Iranian influence by force. I think they've concluded they can't. I think Yemen, what's happening in Yemen, has been a massive part of that. And I think also there's the issue of what the impact of any conflict in the region would have on Saudi Arabia reform plans, particularly Vision 2030. So what they want, and I think even more so the smaller Gulf states want, is the absence of conflict. And I think we saw after the drone attacks claimed by the Houthis, but actually coming out of southern Iraq and masterminded by the IRGC with the Iraqi Shia militias in about 4 years ago on the Saudi oil installations at Al Buqaik and Al Kharais. I think the Saudis concluded that what they needed to do was dial down the tension. So it's not that they don't think Iran is a threat. I think they do. I think in the long term, it is the biggest strategic threat to the Gulf state. But what they don't want is conflict, particularly conflict whose course they cannot predict.
But this balance of power that they have right now, or the status quo, is, I mean, it's very, it's very edgy right now, right? So if you're talking about an absence of conflict, wouldn't there be more conflict, like you said, if long term, with the Islamic Republic staying?
I think, first of all, I think it's absolutely clear that most Iranians, the vast majority of Iranians, want something different. The issue for them, as for everybody else, is how that happens. And if you did get the collapse of this regime, the Islamic Republic, what would follow? And I think one of the things that Khamenei in particular has been very good at since 1989, when he becomes supreme leader, is not just institutionalizing his own rule, but surrounding it with a network of Praetorian guards, so the besieged, the revolutionary guards, and so forth, and his control over massive sources of funding through the Bonyads, through Sepad, and so forth. And so this is. So I think if you're looking at it from Riyadh, or even from Abu Dhabi or Doha or Kuwait, you're seeing a regime you don't particularly like, that would be more comfortable if it was replaced with a regime which is more normal. But you're very worried, particularly in the light of what happened during the Arab Spring and its aftermath, about the consequences of sudden collapse. They'd much rather it changed in ways that made it easier to deal with, and that made the risk of conflict with Israel, with the United States, through its proxies in Yemen and elsewhere, that reduced that. I don't think they know how to get there. I don't think anybody quite knows how to get there, but that's what they prefer. But in the meantime, they're just very worried that any conflict that kicks off is going to be open-ended and is going to affect them more than it affects anybody else.
Oh, wow. So at this point, they do want the regime in Iran to stay.
I think it's a question of the devil you know, I think, for them, which of course is at odds with what I think most Iranians want. So there is a tension there as well, because I don't think, what we've seen over the last few months, and the absolutely brutal crackdown on people, on ordinary Iranians, that's not going to stop. We've seen this accelerating really since the stolen election 15 years ago.
2009.
Yeah, so and what we've seen is these expressions of popular unrest and political dissatisfaction accelerating. And if you look at all the indicators inside Iran, indicators in terms of the economy, in terms of inflation, in terms of the value of the rial, in terms of oil earnings from oil, I say oil export, mainly oil smuggling or discounted, deals with Russia and China, the crisis over water, the crisis over other environmental degradations. This is an accelerating economic and social collapse, it seems to me, inside the country. And the remarkable thing is that the regime seems far more interested in preserving itself than doing anything about all of that. But, so we're going to see more of this. So we're in for, and I think if you're in the Gulf states, they probably think, well, as long as that instability is controlled and doesn't affect us, then we should stay out of it. It's a choice.
And what about, how would the Persian Gulf states react to the potentially the promise of a transitional government? For example, what the Crown Prince has been saying he would do inside Iran should he become, instigate some sort of referendum, et cetera, et cetera. How would the Persian Gulf states react to that? Would that, in effect, take away this absence of conflict for them in their eyes? Would that give them some assurances?
I think it's I think it would. I think they think it's unlikely to happen that way, given the absolute insistence by the supreme leader and his allies on continuing with what they're doing. I think they were still. There are people who say, and I think there's something in this, that actually, that if the Islamic Republic is a huge problem for the Gulf states, for the Arab Gulf states, then a successful, more reasonable, more normal state in Iraq, which maximizes the potential of the country and the people, would be an equally big problem of a different sort. I mean, in the way you saw this in the 1970s, the early 1970s, I mean, Iran was quite a difficult neighbor for the Gulf states because the Shah was so assertive in his claims to leadership, regional leadership, and hegemony, particularly in the Gulf. And I don't think that's going to go away. I mean, given the nature of Iran and the demographics and so forth. But at the end, this should be. I mean, I've always thought this should be win-win, because the Arab, I mean, the Middle East as a whole is one of the least economically integrated regions in the entire world, and the Gulf is incredibly unintegrated, partly because everybody produces oil or gas, and that's it. If you had a market on your doorstep, which is 90 million Iranians, highly skilled, energetic, extremely talented, there's a bit of me that thinks, what is wrong with that? Now, it would need, you'd need to manage it in a different way to the way in which the Gulf states have been used to managing their strategic environment over the last 40 years. On the other hand, the potential, if that happens, for everything else to become unlocked, or a lot of other things to become unlocked in the region, would be extraordinary.
Yes, it would, and it would help accelerate some of these reform plans that Mohammed bin Salman has in Saudi Arabia as well. I would think, at least.
Yes, I mean, I'm pretty sure. Whether this happened from the beginning or not, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that as Vision 2030 sort of took particularly social freedoms, that in a way became also a way of making a contrast between what was happening in Saudi Arabia and the Arab Gulf as well, and Iran. And most Iranians I know, knew that. I mean, they were watching what was happening in Saudi Arabia. Now you might say Saudi Arabia is starting from a pretty low base, particularly when it comes to the freedoms for women and so forth. But it was happening almost exactly at the same time when you had women life freedom, when you had Mahsa, and all the things that came out of that. The contrast was absolutely striking, and so there would be. It wouldn't just be economic competition or cooperation. It would also be a sense of cultural, a social competition, which I think probably would be a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And if we break it down by region, so, if you take one of their non-Arab states, for example, Israel, they're clearly pushing for regime change. Then there's this alliance between the UAE and Israel, even post-October 7th, and Jordan serves to benefit from the fall of this regime. Jordan is very well aware of the fact that the Islamic Republic is trying to destabilize the Hashemite kingdom. Then you've got Turkey,
Yeah.
Turkey appears to be wanting to keep this regime in place. But then, Syria is no longer Bashar al-Assad's Syria. You've got al-Shara, who has proven he doesn't want any Iranian regime interference inside his country. And Lebanon is moving more towards that path as well in trying to weed out the influence of Iran and Hezbollah. So how do these competing visions within this region and alliances even in the region, especially in this, as I said, post-October 7th world, matter for the future of Iran?
I was watching the other day, rewatching an interview which Hamid Reza, when he was still called Al-Julani, gave to Al Jazeera back in, I think it was 2015, 2016. He's being interviewed by Hamid Mansour, who was the star interviewer in those days, still is actually. And Julani has his back to Kamil Khanzi, his head, and it's veiled. And he's talking about what he's doing. And he talks about the two things that strike me looking back at it. One is he talks, as so many actually the insurgents in those days talked about the Umayyads in Syria. This is Umayyi. And he talks about the Rawafid the Shia. So this sort of sense that this is what is happening in Syria then was a very Arab, very Sunni phenomenon, and it was in some ways happening against the Shia. Now that is partly to do with the position that Bashar al-Assad had got himself into with the Iranians, also the involvement of Hezbollah, IRGC, and elements of the Artesh, the army, the armed force, conventional armed force inside Syria. So there was clearly reaction. I mean, Ashara has clearly changed in the way that he presents himself, but I still think that what you're seeing, and this plays to this point about the UAE and Saudi Arabia, is a sense that this is a new, the possibility of creating a new bloc, which is a Sunni-dominated Syria, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, which is a conservative Sunni Arab bloc against others, which at the moment would include, I think, Israel, given the way that Saudi attitudes towards Israel have shifted since October 2023, in some ways understandably, but also the UAE. So you're seeing, it's an interesting, and I'm writing a paper on this at the moment, whether there is a new order emerging in the Middle East. I think there is a new form of disorder probably emerging, which needs to be managed. But I think the Saudis are making a bet on something which is not what the Emiratis are making a bet on. I think the Emiratis, because they're much smaller, they're also phenomenally wealthy. They're interested in routes, trade routes, in access, in dominating the maritime space, and so forth. And the Saudis see this more as a competition for land-based influence. And we're seeing this play out in Yemen and also Sudan. I think that is, I think it's strategic. It'll be very interesting to see what happens with the Kurdish talks with the current Syrian government, and how, because the problem with Syria is it is a country of minorities. Mm-hmm. So if Syria can be stabilized, it does create a new reality. And one thing it does, and one thing it has done actually, is exclude the Iranian's Islamic Republic from the Mediterranean. I mean, when after the civil war breaks out in Syria after in 2011, 2012, what you get actually is an Iranian presence on the Mediterranean for the first time since the 620s. I mean, it was a huge change. That has now been reversed. And it certainly will have a massive impact on what is happening in Lebanon, as well as, of course, what happened to Hezbollah under Israeli assault. So I think that is changing. I think Iran's ability to project power through proxies in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, it's still there, but it's massively weakened. And the question is, what impact is this having on strategic considerations in Tehran? And I think it's very hard to say. If you look at the attitude that the foreign minister Arakchi and others are taking, both in the mediated talks in Oman and elsewhere, but also Arakchi was at the Al Jazeera Forum last week. It doesn't look to me as if they're dialing down the rhetoric, and I think it's a massive mistake myself, because they have an opportunity as well to do a deal which should benefit them. And it's interesting seeing how Pezeshkian is trying to position himself in all of this, somewhere betwixt and between all these different blocks. I think it's going to be a very uncomfortable position for him.
And so I look forward to reading that paper, and when you speak about this new order or disorder, as you put it, and this Sunni bloc, does that mean that they want to keep Iran in this very weakened state?
I think as a matter of tactics, yes, I do think that. I think strategically they'd like it to change, but they don't know how it's going to happen. And they fear the consequences in different ways, both of disorder and of, as it were, catastrophic success. But so for the moment, I think particularly Saudi are being very, very cautious about all of this, and this is also, of course, relates to the way in which the Saudis are interacting with Washington as well in the Trump administration, which has changed, particularly because of the Gaza war.
So how are they influencing Washington right now, and who are the big players that can sway Donald Trump's decision making here?
The Trump administration looks to me like a highly personalized administration. he's working in the Middle East through envoys he trusts. Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner is clearly back. Jared Kushner is very influential. Tom Barak, and Trump himself. Netanyahu is imminently expected in Washington, and will clearly have views on this as well. It's a bit unclear to me. I mean, Netanyahu has his own domestic political problems, and some of this is about him positioning himself domestically in the way that he presents himself internationally. My guess is that the Israelis have plans both to defend themselves against a possible Iranian attack and possibly to take a further offensive action if they think Iran is trying to reconstitute its nuclear program. Can Netanyahu persuade Trump that it's a good idea to take further action himself? I honestly don't know. I mean, the Americans have a lot of hardware in the region now. There's talk that they're waiting until they have replenished their air defense stocks in the region. I mean, they do have bases, Al-Udeid air base in Qatar, various bases in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, which are vulnerable to ballistic missile attack, and the Iranians have ballistic missiles. So I think it's still, I remember when Trump ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, that came, as it were, out of the blue. So who knows? It may be that Trump himself hasn't made his mind up. I presume he has. I have no inside information about what's happening in Washington or what's happening in the White House, but I mean, he's clearly keeping all his options open. And Trump is saying, we want ideally some sort of comprehensive deal with the Iranians, not just about nuclear, but about other things as well. But the Iranians are saying, no, all we'll talk about is nuclear, and even then on a very restricted basis. I just think, really?
No, that's definitely, they're not going to work. It's both their red lines, right?
Yeah.
But it's interesting when you spoke about Qasem Soleimani. I was reading a book, Target Tehran, and according to that book, the decision on Qasem Soleimani was very last minute, and Trump is kind of going back and forth, and is known to kind of take whoever the last person in his ear, whatever they say. And he asked the head of the CIA at that time, are there consequences if we kill Soleimani? And she said, yeah, of course there's consequences, but sir, I can tell you that the consequences of not killing him will be far greater. And then he made his decision, well, then kill him.
Yeah, well, there was a moment back in 2000, I'm trying to remember what the date was, 2007, 2008. I mean, when I was in Iraq, every time I went to go and see someone in the government compound in Iraq, which was called Little Venice, because it had small canals, it was like every time I went, Qasem Soleimani had just been there for breakfast. I mean, it was just extraordinary. And there was a moment, when Qasem Soleimani was in, and the Iranians were shaping the insurgency. They were supplying the IEDs and the AFPs, which were taking American and British lives. And there was a moment when the Americans had him in the sights, and they called it off. That was about 2007, 2008. I think Petraeus talks about it somewhere. So it was thought of before, but I think they all sort of backed off, but partly because of concerns about legality, and secondly about the possible repercussions. Actually, when Qasem Soleimani gets killed, there are no repercussions. I mean, so they launched some performative attacks on
Iraq, on the bases,
concussions of various sorts. But in practical terms, nada, nothing, rien. Nichts.
And same with the 12-day war, right? I mean, again, it was a very performative strike in Qatar.
We will reduce Tel Aviv to ashes and blah 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 blah. Well, no, which is not to say you don't want to consider. You need to scrub the question properly. But on the other hand, I think previous American administrations, I think particularly the Obama administration, were extremely reluctant. We saw this over Syria in 2013. To do anything in the Middle East for fear of doing something wrong or producing consequences which would affect a lot of it. And I think what happened in Libya. I was doing a podcast the other today about Libya in 2000. I think what happened in Libya, and in some ways in Syria after 2011, terrified everybody because of the risks of the massive risks of further conflict, civil conflict spreading out, and instability affecting the wider region. I think a lot of that has been overblown.
Yeah, and it appears you don't see that to be the case for Iran, of course, right?
No. I think one of the great differences between Iraq and, for example, Libya, we know that the vast majority, I mean, when you look at, I mean, I know it's difficult to do polling inside Iran, but everything we know, all the polling that's been done, all the intelligence information we've seen suggests that 70% plus, and maybe a lot more now after the brutal massacres of the last 3 months, want this regime gone inside Iran. So you're working in a way with the grain. The question is, how do you engineer a measured transition and a measured successor government? And of course, if you know anything about Iranian history, you can go back to the constitutional revolution. When the Majlis is dissolved in 1911, you then get a decade of turmoil, of civil conflict in certain areas, of territorial disintegration, blah, 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 until you get a coup, until Reza Khan comes along in 1921. So you do have to have an idea, I think, unless you want 11 or more years of turmoil, of what it is you want. I say we. I mean, it's not really up to us. It's to do with Iranians in Iran who make this choice. But they are, in a way, make it possible for them to express their choice. That's my position.
And so where does Ankara fit in all of this?
Ankara. I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, I was talking to a Turkish friend of mine actually recently about this, because I was in Dahuk for the Dahuk Forum up in northern Iraq in whenever it was October, November, and Dawatoli was there. Dawatoli stands up and he makes a speech, and the first thing he says is, everybody talks about neo-Ottomanism, it doesn't exist, and then he spent 30 minutes telling us all about neo-Ottomanism. So there is a sense. There is a sort of sense of historical deja vu when you it's like the Ottomans against the Safavids. A lot of their conflicts actually happened to what is now Iraq, particularly up in northern Iraq. I know my Turkish colleagues think I'm mad when I say things like that. But simply in terms,
I can see it.
And simply in terms of the physical position of the two countries, they are there. And whereas the Islamic Republic, Khamenei and acolytes think that they are the representatives of Shia and the champions of Shia throughout the world, and indeed in many ways of all Muslims. I'm pretty sure that Erdogan thinks of himself as the champion of Sunni Muslims. And I think he sees himself, because of the Ottoman past and, the religious affiliations, that Turkey has a particular position in the Arab Middle East. I think it's a mistake. And I think we saw that in Libya after 2011. I think in a way we are going to see it in Syria as well. You can overestimate the ability of the Turks to shape Arab politics. But Erdogan clearly has ambitions. Not just in the Arab Middle East, in the Eastern Mediterranean. You see it in the way he behaves over oil and gas concessions and the hostility he shows from time to time to the Greeks, to the Israelis, and to the government of Cyprus. I think Erdogan is also smart. I think he is cautious. It is interesting the way that Turkey has maintained its diplomatic relations with Israel, in spite of everything, in spite of the sometimes incendiary rhetoric that Erdogan has used about Israel, because they have shared economic interests, and also Turkey itself is politically divided. It's probably still, if you look at the polling, the AK party is going down in the polls. There are a large number of so-called white Turks who don't like the sort of Islamist-tinged governments that the AK party has inflicted on Turkey over the last 20 years. And Erdogan is clearly aware of that. So he's a much smarter, cannier, and more informed operator than anybody else. And there have been times when Turkey and Tehran have cooperated. They cooperated a decade or so ago on economic issues, on the gold trade through Dubai, which was designed to support the Iranian economy semi-clandestinely. But Syria, I think, has been a test case for them, and I think Erdogan thinks he's probably won in Syria now. I think the jury is still out. I think he's done well. I think the Iranians have been kicked out, but how Syria then positions itself vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia as well as Turkey, and it is interesting that Shadow's first overseas visit a year or so ago was to Riyadh, not to Ankara. Although Hakan Fidan clearly has a long-term relationship with him. I think that's still a process of formation, and in that, the Kurds will play an oversized role simply because of the neuralgic nature of the Turkish-Kurdish relationship. Kurds in Syria, but also the Kurds in Iraq, and to a certain extent, Kurds inside Iran as well.
In Iran too,
When I used to go and see Kakar Masoud Barzani up in northern Iraq, we'd talk about the Mahabad Republic. I mean, the Kurds had a Kurdish state once, which lasted for under a year, which was the Mahabad Republic in 1945. And collapsed, and key members of the Mahabad government were hanged in the main public square. That was in Iran. So that whole area up there, from the sort of old Kurdish area stretching from northern Syria through Iraq into Iran, is really interesting. And it's interesting to see the way in which Tehran has been explicit about talking about Iranian Kurds not making any trouble, because that's potentially a problem for Tehran, as the Baluchi insurgency in the southeast is as well, and indeed the Azeri connection up in the north. Disentangling all these threads is really difficult. I think the Turks have played this quite well. They're being very cautious, but they have ambitions which, in the long run, I think are incompatible with a powerful Iran.
So at the end, it seems that most of these neighboring countries, other than Israel, really don't want to have any sort of regime change. They just want to keep the status quo and not necessarily see the Islamic Republic successful, but just keep the Islamic Republic in this weakened state that it is.
That's what it looks like to me.
Yeah.
Poor Iran.
Yeah. But I mean, don't they realize, looking in the next even 5 years, that this is not going to last? Like you said, environmental collapse, economic collapse, political collapse, a country that it really doesn't like them and want them gone.
Absolutely. And my friend and colleague at Cambridge, Ali Ansari, calls it a zombie state. It is a zombie state. I think Karim Sajidpour has called it the same thing. I mean, Karim is great. I was ambassador in Burma as well as large parts of the Middle East, and a regime, the Burmese junta, the military junta, is appalling. It's economically illiterate, it's predatory, it's oppressive, all the things that people say about the Iranians, but it could sustain itself under sanctions. If you have access to money and the regime itself stays united, I think you can survive a long time. I think it's massively damaging to the country. I think it's massively damaging to the people. But you can't, especially if you're prepared to kill your own citizens if they come out in the street. And I understand why. So we saw, the wave of protests that happened in the region from, say, 2005 onwards. So if you go back to Lebanon, to the Syrian Revolution in Lebanon onwards, a lot of these uprisings were headless. I mean, there was no leader. And that's the difference between what happened in 78, 79 in Iran, where you had Khomeini coming up outside and all these idiots thinking that Khomeini was going to be the secular savior of a wonderful new Iran. You can never take enough account of the idiocy, particularly of intellectuals. And the reason this happened, one of the reasons this happened, is because they knew that if anybody stood out, they would be killed. They'd be arrested, and they'd probably be executed, or they'd be assassinated. And that happened. You saw that with the Tashrin movement in Iran in Iraq in 2019 as well, where again the Iraqi government used maximum force and picked out individuals, and then either disappeared them or co-opted them, gave them seats in the parliament, which meant they were neutered. But the problem with these headless uprisings is you do need someone to be at the head. You do need someone to represent an alternative. It can't just be because everybody hates you. There's got to be everybody hates you, and this is the answer, really. And that's the missing piece for me.
But what about the chants that we're hearing coming out of Iran right now, asking for the crown prince to return, for example? Doesn't that make it different than what we saw, for example, in 2022 to 23 with the Women Life Freedom movement?
It does, and I thought. I mean, I was surprised. He actually, I thought, handled the whole thing pretty well. I think I think it's very difficult to judge. There will clearly be people inside Iran who would be okay with some sort of return, even if it's temporary, of the Pahlavis. My guess is that they're a minority. My guess is that people would like a return to a form of constitutionalism that they saw aborted once in Iran in 100 years ago, and was cancelled after 1979. What support? I know he said, I'm prepared to go back to Tehran. The circumstances in which he or anybody like him could go back to Tehran and survive are so different. I mean, if you think about what happened in 1978-79, the Shah was ill. The Shah left in January of 79. Khomeini comes back on an Air France plane. Thank you, Air France.
Yeah.
And he's got supporters on the ground, and the army itself thinks it's done a deal with Khomeini, that they will lay down their weapons of sandbag, and then there'll be a new. Well, they learned the very hard way that there was no deal you could possibly do with these people. But it would be different. It would be he'd be walking into his doom, I think, if he went back.
Well, and also, sorry to interrupt. I was going to say that the Shah famously was in a helicopter looking over atop the protests and the revolutionary movement, and he said, "My people don't want me here, and what can I do?" Someone said, "We have to shoot and kill." He goes, "Well, I don't want to kill my people," and he didn't.
In that whole period, from the riots of whatever it was, 63, the famous in Qum and Mashhad, up to 79, the Shah's regime, including Savak, this beast called Savak, there were about 3,200, 3,300 people killed. That was basically, we don't know the full count of the last massacres, but that was maybe a week's worth with this lot. And if you think about how many thousands, if you include the Iran-Iraq War, hundreds of thousands of people whose deaths they are responsible for. Everything, it's not that the Shah was perfect. He wasn't. There were lots of mistakes that were made, and blah, 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 blah. But it seems to me to be an absolute mooncast shadow compared with what we see now. But that also means that the stakes for anybody who wants to replace this regime are very high, because they will kill to stay in power.
Yeah, some people are even calling it a counter-revolution to the revolution that was stolen from them in 1979. And I wanted to ask you, one message that we have been hearing from Iran, and it's very sad, some people are saying, we're the only people in the world inside Iran that look up at the sky and are hoping for bombs to drop, because that's how desperate the situation is for some form of U.S. intervention, something, because they're unarmed. And as you said, they just killed them, right? So from your perspective, and given your background, how should the UK and the EU weigh this moment, and what responsibility do they carry?
I think we have limited ability to influence what's happening inside Iran. We are, in the UK, is a member of the E3, which was the EU3, until we left the EU in 2015. And the last significant card we had was triggering snapback sanctions, which we did because of the failure of the Iranian regime to comply with the terms of the JCPOA. I think there's a certain amount we can do domestically, and I've written about this. The IRGC, the prescription of the IRGC. But it's certainly action against the IRGC and the organs of the Iranian regime inside Britain, as the Germans have started to take action, and the French, against institutions of the Iranian state within Germany and France. I think the Germans closed the Hamburg Center, the Islamic Center, and so forth. The Islamic Center in Maida Vale, the last time I looked, is still open. It was closed down in 2023, but then was allowed to reopen by the Charity Commission, even though it is. I was looking this morning at the statement of religious independence on their website. It's ludicrous. The foundational documents of the centre say that one of the trustees has to be a representative of the supreme leader. So, and they interfere in British politics. So it's quite clear. It's very interesting what happened actually when the uprising started in Iran. How many accounts supporting Scottish independence suddenly went dark when they cut the internet off? Mm-hmm. They were clearly sponsoring, as others do, bots seeking to break up the United Kingdom. So, there's a bit in there that says, grow up, do something about the things you can do something about. Hostile state actors, which include the IRGC, and also its extensions. Do something about that. Ban them. Stop them doing what they're doing. Arrest people. Do something about funding flowing through London. Now, this is a particular initiative for the United States because of the power of the dollar. But if you look at the way in which senior members of the regime have enriched themselves, and you see this as well with Iraqi Shia politicians as well, and have positioned their assets offshore, overseas, Go after that. Now, some of the people will say, well, we do sanction individuals. Yeah, I just think a lot of that is very slow and very late. And I'm not sure how much due diligence we're really doing on the full extent of their assets overseas. So there are some things we can do in terms of constraining the ability of the Islamic Republic to carry out hostile activities on our soil or against us, or to support themselves in Iran by using the institutions of liberal democracies, including financial institutions. I think we should be far more stringent about all of this.
And I'm just curious, the Iranian regime always threatens to close the Strait of Hormuz. How likely is that? And given the fact that they have repeatedly made these threats, are the Arab neighbors prepared for such an event?
I think the Arab neighbors could have been more prepared. It always struck me as odd that neither Saudi Arabia nor the Emirates had constructed over the last 30 years alternative means of getting their oil to market by bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, they've started doing it now. I mean, but it's and they used to have a line essentially across to Aqaba and Jordan, the tap line. So reliance on the seaborne trade, and when we've seen with the Houthis' attempts to restrict access to the Red Sea through the Bab el-Mandeb, the impact it's going to have. I think it's applied in the 1980s as well. Any attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz also massively affects Iranian oil exports. The biggest oil export terminal is down at Karg Island, down in the southern Gulf. And they have to get out through Hormuz as well. If you close Hormuz, you're closing it off to your shipping as well and your oil exports. And there's a certain amount you can put over land, but if it's very expensive, it's a long way. And given that most Iranian oil exports, even when it's legal, and especially illegal, go out that way and they go east to China, I think it would be cutting off their nose to spite their face, which is not to say they won't do it, because they tried to do it in the 1980s. But I think it would be a very foolish move. And I think this is another issue. If Iran changed and you had a new government and Iranian oil became more freely available in the international market, given that oil at the moment is between $60 and $70 a barrel, I think the downward pressure on prices would not be great for the Arab Gulf states. I think that is another factor in the considerations. So the Iranians could try and do it. I think in some ways, if they decided to mine the straits, it would be a bit more difficult to deal with it, because we were an integral part of the demining effort in the 1980s during the Iraq War. We lack the mine countermeasure vessels that we used to have. I think we sold them off or decommissioned them, which is a big mistake. But there are others. The Dutch have quite a lot, and so forth, and the Americans. So you could. It would be a problem, and it would bring in more Western maritime forces into the region. I think the Russians and the Chinese would probably try and act as disruptors. But it's in the Chinese interest to keep Hormuz open. I think in many ways, that's the most powerful argument against it on the Iranian side.
Sir John, is there anything you'd like to add that we haven't touched on?
I hope Iran changes. I really do. I hope the regime changes. I would love to see the regime go as peacefully as possible, and a new regime take its place, which is better for Iran and for Iranian people. I genuinely do.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and really appreciate your time and your expertise, Sir
You're
John
very
Jenkins,
welcome.
joining us on Eye for Iran. Beyond the geopolitics, are real lives shattered? Today we hear from Mina. Now, she has a close friend who is one of the slain protesters, Hamid Reza Najari, and she also has 2 childhood friends who are now imprisoned. Her story offers a window into what's happening inside Iran and what people there would like the world to understand. Mina joins us from Germany. For security reasons, we are withholding her last name and her image. Thank you so much for being here, Mina.
Thank you for invitation.
Of course. So you were close to Hamid Reza Najari, one of the protesters who was killed on January 8th. Please begin by telling us about him, and who was he, and what happened exactly?
Yeah, for sure. Hamid Reza Najari was 48 years old, and he was part of the protest in the revolution, in the Iran revolution. He went out to the street on 8th and 9th of January after the call of a rally in Iran. like a million others in Tehran, he went also to street with his friends. So on 9th of January, the second night of these protests, he didn't come back home because he got shot from Islamic regime guards. This is at least what we know, because he was lost in the crowd and he lost his friends at this night. So the day after, they go after him and wanted to know, how is he, where is he? And the police or the guards told the friends and family that he is alive and he is in one of the prisons, which we now know that was a lie. Because after 20 days, they got the body from Hamid Reza
So
back.
it took
He
20
was,
days to release the body.
yeah,
20
it did.
days.
And during all these 20 days, they thought that their beloved ones is alive. But
I'm sorry, that's heartbreaking.
yeah, but they got his bodies back with a shot from behind. So we don't know if this shot was at that night or it was later. But where they go with him to the protest was Andarzgu Street. It's one of the streets in northern part of Iran, and this may happen there.
Hmm. So there's
yeah.
no way of knowing.
No, this is what they get as an information, and as they said, as they got the body of Hamid Reza back, there was some points they had to follow. First of all, they were not allowed to do some ceremony or some funeral. Maximum 4-5 people. But in a very limited time, under 1 hour, to finish everything, which they did. So there was no gathering, no funeral for him. He went in silent, and that's why it's our duty to be his voice, because he said, I mean, the friends, before they go out at that night, they knew that something like this can happen to any of them. So they promised each other, if one of us do not come back, it's the duty of others to make the world knows about us and why did we go out.
And what do you think, based on your conversations with his family, what do you think that message is that he wanted to get out?
They went out for a future of Iran, for an Iran without Ayatollahs, without Islamic Republic, without Khamenei. This is what they wanted. They went out after Reza Pahlavi asked for these 2 nights, and they wanted him as their last hope to come back to the country and help them for this transition. This is the message.
And when the family was able to collect the body, what did they describe seeing in terms of bullet holes and injuries that he may have sustained?
What I know is that the shot was from behind, and I don't know, and the family do not know when exactly the shot happened. So if Hamid Reza died on the street and this night, or he was arrested and got shot later, this is something we don't know.
Wow, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Um, and tell me, you have 2 childhood friends, Damun and Yashar. They're now in prison. Tell us their story. That's, there's different aspects, right? There are those that have been killed. There are those who have now been in prison, potentially disappeared under those circumstances. Tell us.
Yes, for sure. Damun and Yashar comes from northern part of Iran. I know Yashar from my childhood, and he is the bigger brother. Damun is the younger brother. They got arrested also in one of these 2 nights. I don't know exactly which one. So the story that I know is that Damun got arrested first, and then the brother go after him, and they arrested him. There was one call from them from prison that they are alive and they are in Lakan prison in Rasht. Rasht was one of the cities who got the worst attacks and shots. So this is the last information I have. I tried my best with the in last days that there is a lot of some possibility to call and connect to get information, but unfortunately I don't have any.
And Mina, like you said, with Hamid Reza, the family was told that he was in prison and alive too.
Yes, this is what they told. That's what I'm pretty sure about the numbers. This is much higher than what we hear because they do not give the bodies of people to them, of their beloved ones, and they keep it and they release, let's say, some bodies after a period of time. This is something I heard from many friends that that the bodies they keep it for some times and give it later. So I believe the numbers we know is going to be much higher.
Oh, and so at this point, no contact with your childhood friends.
No, I don't have any contact with them or anybody from their families.
I'm very sorry to hear this. And when I was looking up the
Because
news,
the families are very, very under pressure, so
yeah,
they
tell us
don't
about
know.
that.
They don't know if it's better to talk about it or it's better not to talk about it. So this is all families who have their beloved ones in their prisons, or they believe that they are in the prisons. They don't know what is better, so you cannot come to the information more accurate.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about how these families are being treated to give people an idea of what's happening here.
We cannot imagine it. We cannot even imagine a minute of it. To be at the funeral of your beloved sister, brother, friend, just because other part of the families may get the problem, is something that you cannot imagine. So I know also too many other people. They are not my relatives or friends, but I know from others that they really are shocked because they don't know how to handle the situation. Should they go to media? Should they keep this silent? Are their beloved ones alive? Are they already dead? So this is like a nightmare from 8th and 9th of the January till today.
A nightmare that continues, like you said. And based on your conversations with people inside Iran, what is it that they want all of us to know? Tell us also, like, what is the mood like? Just describe it to us.
You know, people went on the street from, let's say, when the last battle against this regime starts, because there are like many years that we are trying our best to get rid of this regime. For me personally, it started 16 years ago with the Green Revolution, and it just continued till now. So this battle, this last battle, started end of December when the Bazaris closed their shops and people came to the street, and it meets this highest point in 8th and 9th of January. People came to street and they said very clear that they don't want this regime. They don't want a reform. They want them to fall. They want a new life. They want a better life. They said Javid Shah. They said this is the last battle. Pahlavi will come back. They said down to dictator. They said down to Khamenei. This is exactly the words that we heard from Iran after we got some videos. And this is very important for me personally, living outside Iran, to amplify exactly this voice, because there are 90 million of people arrested in their country. They cannot breathe. They cannot have funeral for their beloved ones. They cannot talk, and it's our minimum duty to amplify this voice, to amplify exactly these sentences, which comes from millions of people from Iran, no matter small cities or big cities like Tehran or Mashhad.
And, we talked on the phone before all of this, and there's something you told me that really stuck with me. It truly broke my heart, Mina, when you talked about how, in the Western world, we are gearing up for a global day of action with protests happening in Toronto, Munich, and LA. Tell me what the people of Iran told you about their feelings towards the Munich protests happening.
People in Iran are very frustrated. They are sad. They lost their beloved ones, and they are frustrated because they say, what else should happen to us? How many more people should we lose that we tell the world these dictators are not good for Iran and are not good for the world? And after this 14th of February rally was called also from Reza Pahlavi, there is a big hope there. People called me, they wrote me, are you go there? I said, for sure. This is the minimum thing we can do. And this brings them a little bit of hope. Okay, maybe this time the world listen to us. Maybe this time they see and hear that we cannot do anything with empty hands against a very brutal regime who just shot us on the street. There is a friend of mine who wrote me 2 days ago, as she was sure that I go to this to the Munich demonstration day. She wrote me that she checked the weather, that these days going to be rainy, and if it's the reason that maybe people don't go. So she was very afraid that some people don't join because the weather is not good. And I just told her, don't worry at all. We all go, even if the stones comes from the sky. And we will do it. This is our duty, to be their voice.
And how does that make you feel that someone was so desperate inside Iran, given everything that they've been through, tens of thousands dead, martial law enacted, and here she is looking up the weather app for Munich?
This is the biggest fear the people in Iran have, that the regime killed 40, 50, I don't know how many thousand of us, and now they can make us silent out of Iran, in Iranian out of Iran, and then everything come back to normality as the system wants, and they get even more brutal. This is the biggest fear that people have in Iran, and they know they cannot do with empty hands anything about them. So they need help, if it's a military help, if it's whatever, if the other countries can help. They need a power more than ayatollahs. So this is the only way you can come out of this nightmare.
Yeah, tell us more about specifically what they're asking for. Like you mentioned, intervention. Tell us more about that, because I think that's something in the Western world they don't understand. And I've been even seeing protests saying, hands off Iran, no war with Iran, when in fact people inside Iran say, well, there already is a war, and it's a war that the Islamic Republic is waging against their own people.
I can tell you there are people in Iran who just control the air traffic every night to see if there are less airplanes in the sky. So maybe this is tonight that the intervention helps us. You have to be in some point that wish another country comes and brings military to your country to save you. And this is the point Iranian just reached. That's what I mean. We don't have to change the sentences, the words that people chant on the street. I can imagine that in Western eyes, this is impossible, that people wish for another country who comes and save them with military attack. But this is the last choice. We tried 16 years of every possible way to get a better life. Even from 16 years ago, we started with the reform. We said, okay, maybe we find somebody in this system who can change it, but it didn't change. So now this is the only possible way to get rid of them.
And how are you holding up?
I feel very bad, to be honest. My life is changed in a way that I believe it never going to be like it was before 8th and 9th of January. I don't know if it's a trauma, I don't know if it's sadness, I don't know what is it, but I'm pretty sure it's never going to be like it was before. Seeing all these beautiful souls who leave us just for no reason, they went out and they demonstrated, that's it. But you lose them and you know you may lose more. I feel very, very sad every day. And like any other Iranian, I check the news every 20 minutes to see maybe something new comes up.
No, I agree. I think none of us will ever be the same after this, and just learning about a lot of these victims. I recently did a story about one of the victims who, back in 2024, had made a video on Instagram where it was his own voice narrating the video, talking about, well, if one day if I die before my dog, I want my dog to see my lifeless body because she understands death, and if she doesn't see my lifeless body, she'll think that I abandoned her. I mean, that's the most heartbreaking and beautiful thing, and shows you how they're the polar opposite of this regime that considers, dogs to be unclean, for example.
Yeah.
And every person, he was a auto mechanic. We've got a girl who had an Instagram page where she was on her motorcycle, across Iran, which is banned for females, right? Which is, I mean, these incredibly talented, beautiful, young people who just wanted a normal life.
This is exactly the point, because people in Iran, especially the very young people, they believe, okay, this is not a life I have. I cannot do anything I want, nothing. So let's try to change it. And even this let's try to change it comes to this brutality. And that's for me, someone who just lived from outside Iran for many years, and I don't have that much relatives and friends in Iran right now. But listen, I have 2-3 people close to me who get affected. I can imagine people who live in Iran with their big families. They are even much more affected with the whole tragedy.
Yeah, everybody knows somebody, right? You,
Exactly.
your childhood friends, Hamid Reza Najari, everybody. We all know somebody.
Yes.
We're all impacted by this in some way. Mina, John, is there something you'd like to add that you want to get your message out there? You've been very brave to come and speak to me. I appreciate that. Please let me know if there's something you want to get out there.
I just want to, this is what I really wish for people outside Iran. We are living in democratic countries. We are living in freedom. We have to use it. We have to stay powerful and stay the voice of Iranian inside the country. We have to just amplify what they say. I know this is, many people say this is freedom of speech. Everyone can tell their ideas. You can also have another idea, but this is not the time, because there are 90 million people arrested in their country. They have no voice. They have no hope but us to tell what they say outside Iran. So I wish we are very strong by now, but I wish it to stay like this till the day that we don't have this regime anymore.
Thank you so much, Mina, for joining us, and thank you for your bravery.
Thank you so much for the time.
A high-stakes meeting in Washington between President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, with U.S. military movements increasing and tensions rising. What was really decided, and what does it mean for Iran's future? Joining us now is Dr. Eric Mandel and Ambassador John Craig. Thank you so much for both being here. Dr. Mandel, we'll start with you. You recently returned from Israel, and you met with senior officials there. Based on what you heard, how should we interpret President Trump's remarks, and also Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's remarks as well following their meeting?
So it is an unbelievable fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu has met with President Trump 7 times in little over a year, which is, I don't think of any other world leader who's ever had that type of close and frequent relationship with an American president. But this trip seemingly was very rushed because Prime Minister Netanyahu was going to be in the United States next week for the Board of Peace, and there was also an APAC meeting that he was planning on attending. So why did he rush over? He rushed over because he was worried that the negotiations that the United States is having in Oman with the Iranians is going to only be a nuclear-focused issue, and it's going to leave out ballistic missiles and support for proxies. And the question is, based upon all of the president's statements, why are people maybe worried about this? Because you have different people who speak into President Trump's ear. You have people who are more traditional, and maybe like Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. And then there were people like Vice President Vance and others who talk into the president's ear who are more isolationist and saying Israel could do whatever it wants, but we don't want to be doing it for them. It's not helping them. It's not an American national security. So you have these two worlds of going on, and it gets to the question: is what is America's goal, and how can we accomplish it? So, is America's goal regime change? I don't think it's America's goal. I think in this transactional administration, America's goal is possibly to control the nuclear weapons, but Bibi rushed over because ballistic missiles were not involved. That is Israel's most existential threat at this point of time. And if America's goal is not regime change, and America's goal is going to be limited, why would America's goal be limited? Because President Trump wants to have quick victories, one and dones. This is not going to be a one and done. This is going to take a long commitment from the United States to be involved. To first, well, here are your options. There are economic options. You can go after Kharg Island, where there is a refineries. You can go after tankers. You can go after IRGC and Bajij command and control centers. You can go after the leadership. You can go after ballistic missiles, nuclear. The amount of sorties, the amount of Tomahawk missiles, the amount of cruise missiles, the amount of drones that you're going to need is going to need to be sustained. And I guess the best way to look at this is why regime change may be not considered a priority of the United States. It has been reported back in the Washington Post after the June war, the 12-day war, by Ignatius, David Ignatius, who's one of the lead international reporters. He said that Israel was beginning a final phase to destabilize the regime. In fact, Israel had jets in the air that were going to be targeting the IRGC, and President Trump called them back to keep this war small and not let it expand. And again, it gets into what do each one of these leaders want? Israel wants Iran to fall. America wants a stable region. And remember, who's whispering in President Trump's ear? The Saudis, the Qataris, the Egyptians, who have now believed that Iran is weak enough that they don't need the regime to fall. In fact, if the regime falls, if this regime collapses, who's the most likely player to take over? That's the IRGC and remnants of it. And it is not something that they want because they could also be targeted if the Iranians feel isolated. We remember 2019, the Aramco facility was hit and President Trump in his first term did nothing about it. So you're dealing with many different dimensions here. And again, what America wants, what Israel wants, what the Iranian protesters want, don't seem to be in agreement. But from my perspective, as somebody talks about American national security interests, I believe it is in America's national security interest to be actively involved kinetically, especially after the president really encouraged the Iranian protesters to go out, that we would have their backs. And did those 40,000 people die in vain?
You know, that's very compelling point that I've been hearing from the people of Iran too. And unfortunately, we already had one known suicide of an Iranian man who recorded a video directed to President Donald Trump. He did it in English. He was from Bushehr, and then he killed himself after making that video because the talks were happening. And he's like, we didn't go out into the streets for there to be talks. You know, people didn't die for a better nuclear deal. And why is that? Why is it always such a focus, the nuclear issue, when we know that the Iranian regime does one thing very well, and that's lying?
You know, it's funny. I have a quote. I wanted to just read it to you from a longtime Khamenei advisor, Mohammad Javed Larijani. He said, quote, "It's Persian wisdom. We don't have to be ideal people. Everybody lies. Let's be good liars." I appreciate the transparency of the tadia, which is basically religiously approved dissimulation, which is basically religiously approved lying for a greater good. We know that they cheated so much after the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. I had a first row seat in the Senate, in the U.S. Senate at the time when it was going on, and to believe that Iran, now 10 years later, complied, you have to be really incredibly foolish. But I think one point that is not made, the Iranians, and people are buying into this, the Iranians are claiming they have a right to enrich uranium. Now, when the world's leading state sponsor of terror is given the right to enrich uranium because it signed the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it's not true that they have that right because they've had so much non-compliance with the IAEA safeguards. And the NPT doesn't guarantee unrestricted right to enrich uranium. They already enriched uranium at 1.84%. They don't need, in theory, anything more than 3.5-ish%, way beyond civilian levels. And they also expelled the IAEA inspectors. So anybody who believes that you're going to get a nuclear deal that's going to be enforced, and there'll be consequences when they don't do it, or you haven't found out that they're cheating behind the scenes, because the regime, what does it want? It wants to maintain what it is. It wants eventually to get back to being hegemonic. And it has what we don't have in the West, strategic patience. They can think in decades. They can outweigh President Trump. That is a failing of being in a democracy. I'm glad I'm in a democracy. But from one administration to the next, to keep its word, so to speak, or its policy, it doesn't really happen very often in American politics or in strategic policy.
Yeah, and like you said, it's within U.S. national security interests. And was it the Taliban that said, "You've got the watch, we've got the time"? Ambassador Craig, what are your thoughts, especially given that the Pentagon is reportedly preparing a second U.S. aircraft carrier deployment?
For inviting me. I always enjoy your interviews because they're very well thought out. And, I'm enjoying Eric's discussion with you. I think we're in a completely different environment here. President Trump made it possible for this negotiation to take place in Oman. He knows perfectly well what the Iranians are asking for, but he went ahead with the negotiations, and now he's agreed to a second round. I think this is just giving the Iranians a chance to hang themselves. If you notice, the carrier was the preparations for the carrier are at the request of the president. So now we're going to have the most powerful, well, we already had the most powerful armada there, and now we're going to have a double armada there. And I think this is just part of President Trump's plan to demand the terms that he's asking for. And it's a prequel, in my view, to military action. Now, again, I think we're in a totally different area, a totally different environment with regard to Iran. The Iranian leadership is petrified. The results of the June 12-day war have left them really in a state of existential terror. And so they're fighting for the whole regime. They're not just fighting for the next negotiations with President Trump. And I do accept the issue of the IRGC and what happens if the Iranian collapses. But I'm less worried about that because I think they're going to collapse anyway. The pressure that the president is putting on them, I believe, is it's either going to end in their capitulation, which I don't think they're capable of, so it'll end in some sort of military action. I can't believe that the president and Prime Minister Netanyahu didn't talk about the potential for military action when they met yesterday. I think that would be perfectly normal, because any action that we take is going to have to be supported by.
But what did you mean by that when you said, I can't believe they wouldn't talk about it? Do you mean to say that in a figurative sense, or do you mean that they kept that part confidential and are not revealing it?
Well, of
What
course
did
they
you mean
kept
by
that
that?
part confidential. Absolutely, they kept that part confidential. So I'm looking for some dramatic action, certainly after, maybe during the next negotiations, because we know already that the Iranians are going to are trying to spin out the negotiations. They're trying to buy time. Even they've said that. And so I just think we're in totally uncharted territory here. And I think that the Iranian regime, in terms of the mullahs, is on short lifespan. With regard to the IRGC, they're going to have to make their accommodation. They can't immediately come out and try to challenge the United States and Israel. So if it ends up that the mullahs are gone, and they're in charge, they're going to have to look someday to find stability and continue on. And I'm not worried about that. I think that Iran and the world will be better off without the mullahs. And right now, they are on a very difficult footing. If they go, there's not an Iranian. Well, maybe the IRGC, but there's not an Iranian in Iran who doesn't want to see the mullahs topple. And so I think it's a perfectly normal reaction.
And Ambassador Craig, when you said you expect big action coming from the United States, what kind of targets would you foresee for military strikes? Would that be taking out the supreme leader, for example, in his bunker, wherever he's hiding?
I think we already did a lot of that damage in June. And so I'm looking for a pretty robust role by the government of Israel in terms of targeting and the military attack. But I mean, President Trump is doing is on a classic diplomatic line. He's got every military capability right there. They can see it. And he's essentially, what he's asking them to do is accept his terms or else. So far, they have not been able to accept his terms, and they are telling him that they can't accept his terms. So the or else is there. The or else is going to happen.
So then, a question to both of you. What is the point of all of this? Is it just to buy time from both sides? Are they both stalling? Like, I don't even want to call this negotiation. What are they negotiating at this point? It seems like there's talks about talk negotiation. Dr. Mandel, we can start with you, and then we'll go to Ambassador Craig.
I think one of the things, as I mentioned before, there are people who are in the Trump administration who were isolationists. And I think the president, even if he's more inclined to do something kinetically, he wants to show that he's gone to the nth degree, that he has gone through all the diplomatic channels and tried everything possible. The problem is that I believe that we're outmatched by the Persian Bazaar and their negotiating skills. And I can see them dragging this out, and because we'll think that they're conceding certain things in delaying enrichment, and maybe lowering the amount that they have, or moving out some rods that they've developed, or maybe even offer a couple of things on the ballistic missile part, enough to make America say, well, maybe there's something here. And again, if this is about the president claiming a victory, going closer to a Nobel Prize, away from that he stopped another war, that's very appealing. Because on the other hand, it's going to be incredibly messy if we strike. This is the law of unintended consequences. That's the name of war. And you have a situation in Iran where you may have 80% of the people being against the regime. I think 20% of the people probably are for the regime. Many people's economics are based upon stealing from the Iranian people. And I think the IRGC controls so much of the government. Supreme leader has a conglomerate, I think it's Sadat, that has $100 billion in it. I mean, these are kleptocrats on top of everything who don't want to go, and they're willing. And we haven't seen defections yet of any significance, where you have people, 1 million militias, you have 150,000 IRGC who are willing to shoot people in the face in a 2-day period, the biggest massacre since 1943 of Babi Yar, when Jews were massacred by the Nazis. And the world is basically silent of what's happening here. So the Americans who are running our country, and if it was Democrats also, the last thing they want is to get into another forever war in the Middle East. And I can tell you, in 2003, I was on an ABC talk show, and I've saved the tape because it's one of the things I think I was maybe a little precedent. I was asked, should America go into Iraq in 2003, right before? And I said, if you don't have a plan for Iran, don't go in. And you see, we're now 23 years later, and everything still evolves around Iran. And again, what we did with Iraq and how it emboldened Iran, what we're going to do in this war kinetically and all the things that will fall out, who knows which way this is going. But I think what the ambassador said about this regime falling is exactly what I heard from the Israelis across the political spectrum. This regime is so horrible. We'll take our chances with regime collapse and hope for the best. And I think that's what the Iranian people are probably saying also. We know it's going to be messy, but look what we have now. I can't imagine anything worse. I mean, look at the things that are unreported by the American media, whether it's the rapes, shooting of doctors, shooting of patients who are intubated, the torture, the unidentified bodies, making people pay for their protesters who were killed. I think they were charging for bullets. They were charging for bullets.
$5,000 US. They can't even afford to eat. $5,000 US. Yeah.
Stuff that nobody knows about unless you're in the weeds here about this stuff. That should be front page news, which would make President Trump's case much better than who we are dealing with. This is not just about nuclear. This will reverberate. The last thing I'll say on this issue is going to reverberate way beyond the Middle East. Who is listening to this? Taipei and Beijing. We're supposed to pivot to the Far East. If we basically abandon the Iranian people, if we basically, if you will, I won't say abandon the Israelis, but leave them to their own devices about ballistic missiles and the proxies, it's going to say a message that America is like the America we've always known. The big, and that they will abandon people for short-term gains. But the big caveat here is this could be a giant ruse. Netanyahu and Trump could be playing bad cop, good cop. They could be playing they could be planning, as the ambassador was talking about this next carrier group coming in, that if you told me tonight, you called me and you said, there was a strike tonight, would I be surprised? No. So I think, and I will tell you one last thing. So when I was in Congress 2 weeks ago with somebody who was part of Trump 1.0, and what he said to me was it was much more conventional back then as far as the foreign policy apparatus. But today, it's really a very close circle of people. That's why we don't get leaks out. So when you asked the ambassador, a question about what maybe was discussed, in the first administration, we might actually have gotten leaks of what happened. Now the group around him is so tight, there are very few leaks. That's good and bad about having a very tight group because you're not taking enough outside influence. But we really don't know, and we should have the humility to say we don't know. But as I say, let's be binary for a second, very American. Regime collapse, very good. That's where we should be going. And American values, our foreign policy values, helping the Iranian people, who, if we give them the opportunity, may surprise us and be able to take charge there. But it's not going to be pretty.
And you mentioned a tight circle. That's an important point. So who is within that tight circle, just to give us a window or an idea of what they're saying and thinking?
I think you have Steve Witkoff. You have Kushner, his son-in-law. I think you have J.D. Vance. I think you have Tom Barak, just one degree of separation. And I'm hoping Marco Rubio, whose office I used to work with some foreign policy advisors when he's in the Senate, which was top notch. As National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, I'm hoping he's part of that inner circle of the decision makers. There are some other people I can't mention. I know one of them who works with one of these people, who's also a very top notch person. But it is a much smaller group, and you don't have congressional influence. Very often, the executive branch never likes to listen to congressional influence. I don't think the State Department of any of the professionals have influence here. So I think I gave you, I feel confident of saying 90% of the people. The ones that I didn't mention, who are not part of actually the administration, who I'm most scared about, is the Tucker Carlson world. I think that world he definitely still has the president's ear, and paints Israel in a horrible light. I mean, it's anti-Semitic and anti-Zionism, two sides of
Conspiracy theorists, complete cuckoo.
I mean,
complete
yeah.
cuckoo.
But dangerous kind of.
Yes.
So if those people are whispering in the president's ear, I worry about, that too. But again, that foreign influence from the Saudis and the Qataris and the Egyptians and the Omanis, and even the Emiratis. And by the way, each one of those has their own interests. But the idea of stability, telling the president not to do kinetic strikes. Now, there could also be a game that they play where America does some small kinetic strikes to show that we actually had a red line and we actually responded. And maybe the Iranians in a kabuki dance did what they did in June and have a hit Al Ubaid, but everybody's evacuated the place and everybody can say they did their thing.
Very
and that
theatrical.
Would be worse. Yeah, very theatrical, but very dangerous on a security interest.
And, you mentioned Tucker Carlson. He's also friends with that influencer, Nick Fuentes. And recently I noticed on social media, it was just disgusting. He went on and said his piece about the Iranian protesters, that they deserve to all be killed. And, he said, F them. I hope that they shoot and kill them. They're all a bunch of traitors. So it's really scary.
Like he's Tucker Carlson is, but I think we should make a differentiation. I think Nick Fuentes may influence Tucker Carlson, but I don't think there's any association in the administration to Nick Fuentes. So I want to be clear about that.
Of course. Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. No, thank you for making that distinction. And Ambassador Craig, what do you think? We also had recently, Senator Kennedy told Iran International, and I'll read out the quote here. I had a meeting with Trump. Trump will keep the promise he made to the Iranian people. We are currently listening to Mossad's assessment. How do you read that?
Well, I think that's a good idea, actually. But let me just go back and put a little bit of context in what was happening in Iran. Look, Iran is in an economic disaster. Is an economic disaster. There's no water. There's no electricity. That's why you had all those people going out into the street. It wasn't, because of repression by the mullahs. It's because they are hurting. The Iranians are hurting. The exchange rate is ridiculous. So the fact that the president stepped up and said he would support the demonstrators was an extremely important step. I mean, if you remember, we didn't take that step when President Obama was in office. When the Iranian people rose up against the election in 2009. So I think there's every good reason to think that the Iranian people are still looking for support. And I think President Trump is giving them that support. I mean, I think Eric is right that we don't know what can happen. Some kinetic action, but I think we've reached the end of the road. I think this next negotiation, the president's not going to let them pull the wool over his eyes and say, "Oh, well, we'll consider this and let's have another negotiating session." I think this is it. and he's already given them the ultimatum. I think if they don't understand it, then they're not as smart as we think they are. So I'm not worried about the reaction. I'm not worried about the reaction in the Arab world, but the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Qataris have been begging us to attack Iran. I mean, if the situation has changed, I understand that, but still, they're going to benefit if the Iranian regime falls apart. And we can't. I don't think we should be scared of that. This is the kind of thing that happens, and it's time for the mullahs to go, for the Iranian people and for the whole rest of the Middle East. And I think it's perfectly logical to assume that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu discussed this during their meeting. They both issued statements that would, not raise too much alarm in the international community, but I think they're ready to go, and I think we should support them.
And any final message, Ambassador Craig, to President Trump?
I think he's doing exactly what he should be doing.
And
what
Dr.
he's
Mandel,
doing.
how about you? Final message to President Trump?
The one issue we didn't mention is the influence that this is an election year in the United States, a midterm election. And there are people in the president's base who don't want him to be involved. And if he gets into a fight here with Iran and it's long lasting, the political advisors are going to be talking to President Trump to understand those implications. So what I would say to President Trump is, you care so much about your legacy, as you should, and you actually have some amazing achievements in the Middle East, Abraham Accords, for example, and helping Israel, so much recently, and really putting before that, moving Jerusalem and, as the capital, and all of these positive things that he did. But I think his legacy would be the cherry on the sundae, as you would say, to be able to bring down the Iranian regime, to help the Iranian people take back their lives. And I would say this is the time. People say you're unconventional. You are. Be unconventional. This is the time to act. It's not warmongering. The Iranians have been given nearly 50 years. It'll be in the 2029 will be 50 years. That the spots will not change of this regime, and it is an American interest, and it will also help the world, and will be leaders of not only for the world being better, but America. I believe in the long term we respect it, and it will help us. I think the strength will bring more chances for peace. And that's what the president wants to be known as a peacemaker. But sometimes you have to use action.
Well, very well said. Thank you so much to you both, Ambassador John Craig and Dr. Eric Mandel, and joining us on Eye for Iran today. Well, if you like this episode, you can hit the like button. You can also leave us a comment and let us know what you think, especially if you'd like to tell us what you want for future topics or future episodes. You can also check out our weekly briefing newsletter at iranintl.com/newsletter. And you can also check out and head to our dedicated English website at iranintl.com/en.